Hello everyone, I'm Kenza Touhs, an alumna of AUI, and I'm here today to talk to you about higher education in China. So first of all, we'll start with some story sharing, then we're going to talk about some interesting facts about higher education in China and education in general, and then we'll talk about the project of Etudierenchine and the procedure that you can follow if you want to continue your education in China. So here's how I started from Ifran here in AUI, and I ended up in Ningbo in Zhejiang province in China, and again back here in Ifran. So during my last semester in AUI, I was studying business administration, and I attended this camp, the career leadership camp that was done by the SHSS school, and the purpose was to help senior students to decide on their career path, on what they want to do, what they want to study. And so that's when I realized that I actually really wanted to go somewhere kind of mysterious, a place where we still don't know what's going on, a place where things are still interesting and fresh and kind of a bit shocking in a way, and places where you could learn very special things. So for me the choice was obviously China, because that was the country that we heard a lot from, but we still don't know much about. And so I started my quest to look for a master's degree in China, which was not easy. So at first I was looking on Google, and then I figured that Google does not work in China. So all the stuff that comes from China is hardly found in the normal websites on Facebook or in Google. With the Chinese firewall on the websites, it was hard to have access to English content and to find Chinese universities or even degrees that are delivered in English. Most Chinese universities deliver their degrees in Chinese, so to find one that was in English was a very hard task. I finally got to find this program, a Master's in Entrepreneurship and Innovation Management, which was exactly what I was looking for, and it was by a British university that was delocated in China, in Ningbo. So I applied for that, I got lucky, I got accepted, I went there, and there started the adventurous journey of China. So when I was studying, I was also working, I was doing a part-time job. I was first teaching. My first student was a little girl, a 5-6-year-old girl who was learning French. I was also teaching English, business English to some businessmen, and later on I started working in export-import and in manufacturing with a Chinese manufacturing company. So that was another highlight, another very exciting experience, because I got to visit factories, I got to visit production lines and see how the whole made in China is actually produced and it's exported to the whole world. It was interesting to see the employees and the workers in the production lines and making their little contribution to this big product and putting it on the line, and it's moving on. So the whole production and export expertise was very interesting to see how it was going on in China. And so for students who are interested in that kind of in that field, industrial production, and international business, international commerce, e-commerce and exports, China is a great place to do that in terms of learning in education, doing a degree in international business, or also in terms of doing internships and part-time jobs and working there as well. So after I graduated, I also continued working in export and for about a year. And after that, I moved on to another field, which was higher education. So I was working as a professor in Zhejiang Business Technology Institute, also in Ningbo. And there I was teaching second and third year students some finance and business classes. And that also was a very special experience. I was in charge of usually a class of 30 to 60 students who were 19 to 22 years old, who had trouble understanding English and who had to pass their exams as well. So I'll be talking later on about the culture kind of of education and of the culture between student and teacher in China. And after that I actually decided to move back to Morocco, and I just did around 2 months ago. So I'm moving back here to see what can be done between China and Morocco, and mostly at this point I'm working on the project of etudierenchine.ma, and it's helping students to go study in China, and I'll talk about that a bit later on. So the in terms of personal experience, or the whole China experience during those 3 years, there was a lot of highlights, I would say. The culture is very particular, it's very special. Traveling in other countries is exciting, yes, but in China is particularly special, I would say. And since you will be traveling there soon, I'm pretty sure you will confirm what I am saying right now. So yeah, the first thing maybe I could talk about is food. The food was very weird at first. To be honest, it was actually very weird at first to get used to it. But honestly, now I cannot get I really need my Chinese meal at least once a week. So I was talking also about the culture, about the difference of the culture and the diversity of China. When we think of China, we will usually think of one country, one culture, one type of people, we kind of visualize it. But that's actually just a generalization. China has more than 56 ethnicities or ethnic groups or nationalities. 56 groups that have very different languages, even very different cultures, different clothes, different features, different music, different everything. It's literally many countries in one huge country. So traveling was very interesting, because you got to see all these cultures, these cultural differences. You get to taste the different foods, and you can pick the food that you actually like and skip the one that you find too weird. Yeah, just on a side note, there is no monkeys, dogs, or anything like that in your dish. It's just chicken and beef, and there's actually a lot of pork as well. But generally, all those weird things we think of, the insects, even in China they're considered weird. Even in China it's considered as a special treat that maybe some people like to try once a year, for example. So when you go, don't worry about that. It's not dog meat in your plate. Right. So I was saying also about traveling. When I decided to come back, I was packing my stuff, and I found this. I gathered a box of train tickets. The railway network in China is very impressive. It's the biggest railway network in the world, and it's connecting all of China. This huge piece of land is all connected by trains, so you will be very practical to really travel by train. And actually traveling becomes one of the main things students do after studying, of course. In China, the traveling experience is very special when you're a student in China, and that's something that most students who go there, they report to be the most interesting thing that happened to them during their time. So I was taking very long trains, from sometimes 45-hour trains, 24-hour trains, to go to the kind of the extremes of the country. I recall the very special areas that, like the Inner Mongolia and the Xinjiang. Xinjiang is actually the biggest province in terms of size, but it's also one of the small minorities. It's the Uyghur people. It's the Muslim minority. The whole region is at this point it's a bit controversial. Maybe you've heard about it in the news. So it was also very interesting to go there and see it by myself. And actually, once you get started with the whole traveling in China for hours and hours, you see that there is no boundaries in all of Asia. Especially that for Moroccans, we do not need a visa to go to most countries there. So yeah, you just go all over the place. Every holiday is a chance to discover a country, and all the Southeast Asian countries and the islands and whatnot. So yeah, that makes the whole studying part easier and more fun. And right, so I'll move now to the second part of the talk, which is about some facts and interesting information about higher education in China. So first of all, I'll start with some basic numbers. We can say that there is 2,900 universities in China, around that, roughly 2,900 universities and colleges. China is the biggest industry of education in the world. In terms of higher education, apparently it is not the first. Apparently India is the first in terms of university enrollments, but the Chinese industry of higher education is also huge, and it's getting bigger, especially that now it's opening up to international students and to the internationalization of their degrees. So now you got more and more international universities that are opening up their campuses in China. You also have a lot of Chinese universities that are starting new programs fully in English. We'll say that most of the degrees in China are delivered in Chinese, but now it is changing. So in 2015, for example, there was around 400,000 international students that came to study in China. The United States is one of the biggest communities of international students, and African students also are actually the fastest growing community of international students in China. The goal for the government, the goal is to attract 500,000 international students by 2020. So what they're doing to reach that goal is that they're encouraging the universities to open more and more degrees fully in English, and they're offering a lot of scholarships to international students, partial and full scholarships. Right, China today is the third host of international students in the world, and by 2020 is also expected to be the second, and overthrowing the UK. So there's going to be more international students who are interested in going to China than going to the UK. That is the trend, and so it's good to know that it is the trend, and to know where the future will be in the for the future of higher education in the whole world. So we can also say that higher education in China is actually based on the Confucius ideology. So you'll see that in the kind of the rituals that universities have. They will have annual gala parties where the students will be acting, doing their dances and shows. You will see that in, for example, the Chinese students have a mandatory period of 2 weeks to 1 month of military training. International students are not affected by that. Chinese students also might have some curfews, which are not applied to international students. So this is part of the Confucius ideology and the philosophy that is behind higher education still today in China. Now I'll share some insights that I found or that I think are very interesting to know about education in general in China. So first, we have to consider the historical context. Education in China at first, it was designed to educate in terms of the most important part of it was values, ethics, morality, philosophy, and basically working in a hierarchical organization. It was the purpose was to train the government officials. So for government officials to go up the ladder of their organizations, they had to go for education, go for to universities, and universities' purpose was to train government officials. So there is still this value and ethics part that is very important in Chinese universities still today, which we do not really see in other maybe other countries, and also in other countries maybe there is more focus on the technical aspect of what a degree is supposed to do, whereas in China there is a really big focus on creating a community, building values, and preparing the students for the work life that they're gonna have, and mostly the hierarchical structure of jobs and of institutions in China. So this is one thing we have to consider, is the historical context of education. The second part is also a historical fact. It's the Cultural Revolution that happened in China, and during that time, that was when the Communist Party had won the elections and Mao Zedong became the chairman. And for that period, the Cultural Revolution, universities actually were closed. Undergraduate degrees were stopped for at least 4 years. The universities were closed for 4 years, and for master programs they were completely closed for 12 years. So there was a whole break in higher education in China that happened, and one of the things why that happened is because there was a trend against the westernization of higher education in China and the westernization of the entire culture, of the Chinese culture. That was when China closed itself for a while to focus on its own values and its own culture, its local culture. So when the universities reopened, they really focused on creating their own pedagogy, their own style of education, and not copying from Western systems. So that's another thing to consider, to understand why education in China is actually different from other countries. Another thing that is very special in China is the Gaokao exam. The Gaokao exam is the BAC, the equivalent of the BAC, the high school diploma in Morocco. And actually, in terms of culturally speaking, it's actually quite similar, because the Gaokao is the most important exam one will pass in his whole life. It's said to decide on your whole future. If you have a good grade, your future will be good. If you don't have a good grade, you're done. So it is really a very strong idea and a very strong attachment to this Gaokao exam. And actually, one of the days where there is the highest number of suicides in the whole world is the Gaokao Day exam and the Results Day exam. So it's an interesting thing to know. So students have a lot of pressure to study very, very hard during their last year of high school to get the best grade possible. Once they do get that grade and they go into university, the general consensus is that their level of hard work will decrease a bit. So you study in primary school, in high school, and you pass the Gaokao exam. This is the top of your hard work and performance. And once you go to university, then you're actually free to relax a bit. So actually, in terms of exams and the difficulty of the classes in Chinese universities, I mean, most students who do their part of the job, they attend their class, they pass their exams, the success rate is actually very, very high in university after the Gaokao exam. Another thing also is the cultural aspect that the examinations have. So exams are very, very, very important in Chinese culture, even outside of education. So even in the in government jobs, exams is how people pass. They get promoted. So everything passes by an actual written exam. So for the students, like working on a project or doing a presentation or doing some activity that is graded is not as important as an exam. The exam is the most important thing that they have. So when we have an exam, students will be studying all day long, all night long. Everything is for the written exam, and they actually managed to get very high marks when it comes to written exams. And with this idea comes the idea of competitiveness. The Chinese culture is actually very, very competitive when it comes to education, but also after education, when it comes to being successful, building a career, and like the end point is being rich. So there is very high competitiveness. It's the country where it's the fastest to become a millionaire. So it is literally a race to success, which is a great thing actually. When you look at the results, when you look at everybody is very motivated to do their best. but the downside of it is that the best universities in China are actually very, very competitive. It's very hard for Chinese students to get in, specifically for Chinese students to get in, because it's a matter of 0.001, the acceptance rate. Another idea I wanted to talk about is the idea of the Laoshi. It's the teacher. Laoshi, the word Lao means old, and the old in a very positive connotation. So it means that he is the sage, the person that knows the best, and all the student has to do is to listen. The teacher is very respected. It is China's ranked the first in terms of how they value teachers, how they respect teachers, and how students they're really obedient and very calm inside the class just because they respect the teacher so much. This is from kindergarten to university. The status of a teacher of Laoshi is very well regarded in China. And from this we can go to the next idea, which is one-way learning. In the Chinese classroom, it is the teacher who is talking. And learning comes from the teacher. The knowledge is supposed to be from one way, from the teacher to the student. So you will not really hear debates in Chinese classes. There is not going to be any student who disagrees with the teacher or who says his opinion that is against what the teacher was saying. So it's going to be the teacher talking and students doing activities, but the whole two-way learning that the American system is bringing, that actually in AUI also, it's an important thing of how education in AUI is built. That is not something that is very popular in China, especially with the students. I was a teacher there, and I was trying to make my students react and just express their own opinions, but it goes both ways. So the students as well, they have this culture of you're the teacher, you know best, we listen from you, and that's it. So for those of you who want to go to study in China and who do go to study in China, I mean, I'm just throwing in these ideas for you to consider. There is nothing wrong with a class where the teacher is the one who is talking. Do not feel bad for not talking or for talking. So it's a whole different culture. This is in their culture. So what we need to do as international students is to adapt to it and to take advantage of it the most. Another idea I wanted to talk about is repetition and remembering. Repetition and remembering is also a core thing in how classes are delivered in China. So what you'll see is there's going to be a lot of repetition from the side of the teacher, but also a lot of repetition in terms of the exercises and the homework that is asked from the students. And the purpose of this is, I mean, it's basically the more you repeat the same thing, the more you're better at it. And that's why you see that in classes where the activity is actually quite mechanical and repetitive, the Chinese students will usually perform better than the international students and doing it at faster speed. Just because of this idea of repetition and remembering, whereas maybe in the more liberal systems of education, like in the AUI or in the US, you'll see that it's not about repetition, but it's more about case by case. So we're doing case studies instead of doing an exercise. So that's also a thing to consider. And the final idea is the concept of face. The concept of that we kind of have in Moroccan culture as well, of hishuma. And that is something that you can see in the class where a student maybe does not understand something and they will not raise their hand and ask a question. Maybe a student has an answer. The teacher asks a question. The student has the answer. It's the right answer. But they're not necessarily going to raise their hand to share that answer. And that's because of fear of losing face. The fear of speaking up in front of other people. And the fear of saying something wrong, specifically in front of your colleagues and your classmates. So all of this is important to know when you want to either teach or study in China, because you'll have to know what are the cultural aspects that your classmates operate by. When your teammate who's Chinese maybe does not want to raise their hand in front of everybody and ask a question, you will know why, and maybe you will raise your hand to ask his question. I think for this part we're gonna move on to why studying in China. What are the arguments or the things that make China an attractive country to go to? So first of all is the diversity of the degrees. You'll find that there is really within 2,900 universities there is definitely a lot of room. There is a lot of types of degrees, a lot of majors that the student can choose from. So that's one thing about the why go into China. Another thing that people mention a lot is the fees. It's the cost of studying abroad, and usually for compared to studying in Morocco, usually going abroad is going to be more expensive. In China it's actually a bit different, because the tuition costs are much lower. It's not for free like it is in many European countries. Just as a side note again, China is a communist country, but most higher education institutes are public, but even the public institutions are not free tuition, but there is a tuition to pay. But the tuition is affordable and is comparable to maybe studying in a middle school or high school, a private middle school or private high school. We'll say that the range for tuition per year is around 25,000 Ds to 30,000 Ds per year. So compared to other countries, that's definitely a very cost-efficient way to have an international degree, an international exposure, and also not spending all your life savings and your family's life savings on that. Also, the point is the living costs are very similar to Morocco. They can even be a little bit cheaper depending on where you are and what city. Living on campus, eating on campus, maybe doing short trips on the weekends and things like that is gonna end up like living in Morocco in terms of costs. So you get all the perks of living abroad without really ruining your or spending all your life savings. The other point why we should consider going to China is because there is more and more relationships that are tied between Morocco and China. The governments are they have signed a lot of conventions, and they're still signing a lot of conventions. There's a lot of companies that are coming to invest in Morocco. There's already a lot of export going on between China and Morocco. Morocco is the first tea importer from in the world actually, and it's coming from China. There's also a lot of export in basically everything. So there's going to be a lot more opportunities for people who have this China experience in their CV, who have worked with Chinese people, who have learned some Chinese, who know about the Chinese culture and the Chinese way of doing business. There is only a growing opportunity in this field. Another thing is that it is becoming a trend. It is the trend. It is becoming a major host country for international students in the world. So that's definitely showing a global interest in education in China. Now learning Chinese is one of the main reasons as well. It is the first, still today, it is the most spoken language in the world in terms of mother tongues. And Chinese is not going anywhere. It is a very difficult language, very, very difficult language. Many actually learners do not end up being fluent. But this is a language that we have to learn. There is no way around it. The world has to learn Chinese. Just because